Another way in which civil liberties and civil rights are very different from one another is the idea that civil liberties and civil rights demand very different things from our political system. And those demands then change the political dynamics of how those things are achieved. So civil liberties are usually secured by the U.S. Supreme Court. It is the role of the U.S. Supreme Court to interpret the U.S. Constitution. And since the fundamental liberties that are protected in our system are listed in the Bill of Rights, then court boundaries of those are, and when there are questions about what freedom of religious expression might mean, or ideas of what does it mean to have freedom of speech or freedom of expression, and how does that expand to ideas about whether or not you can, what sort of money you give to campaigns. Is that seen as direct speech or is that symbolic speech? We'll talk a little bit later in this chapter. But you can see that because the Bill of Rights is mostly made up of these negative rights, these individual freedoms that are protected, then it is the U.S. Supreme Court and its interpretation of what the Bill of Rights actually means in particular cases that will influence to a large extent the individual liberties that we have. That doesn't mean that the decisions made by the U.S. Supreme Court are automatically embraced and accepted. There are ways in which it is very political, and the decisions that are made by the U.S. Supreme Court have always been influenced by politics. We can certainly see that now with the rise of a large number of 5-4 controversial Supreme Court decisions about some fundamental ways in which we live our lives. But even throughout that, there are ways in which many have claimed that the actions taken by the U.S. Supreme Court are undemocratic. They're undemocratic in the way that we talked about when we talked about democracy. They are because they do not support popular sovereignty. Because in fact, as we're going to be talking about a little bit later, some of the restrictions on individual liberties come from we the people. It is we the people who are made afraid or who see the downside to certain aspects of these freedoms that demand action from our government. And it is the U.S. Supreme Court that makes a decision that says, no, you may actually be concerned about internet child pornography, for example. You may want to have prayer in public school. You may think that it is a terrible thing for people to be flag as a symbol of protest. But all of those things, the U.S. Supreme Court makes some decisions, and they have important implications for us and concerns that we have about that. But we argue that those decisions could be undemocratic because they violate another part of the democracy standard, because the individual decisions are not accountable to us, and so therefore it is a problem of popular sovereignty. But others turn around and say that's exactly what the framers wanted. The framers to a court to make decisions without paying attention to the concerns of the people. That's why they were selected the way they're selected. They are there to protect individual liberties, and therefore the Supreme Court is going to be chosen by the president, confirmed by a majority of the U.S. Senate, which then makes it hard for us to have popular sovereignty. But if in fact those individual liberties are really important, it shouldn't matter, some argue, what the people want. And so it points out this important distinction between aspects of the democracy standard. So there's certainly politics related to the idea of civil liberties and how they're implemented in our political system. The other is that when you have the Supreme Court making a ruling, that isn't necessarily the end of the day. People might still be concerned, and so they will try to influence the legislative and executive branches to change the laws in a particular way to be able to deal with the concerns. And it's usually, even though individuals say that and many individuals say that they are in favor of protection of civil liberties, when they are made afraid because of something like 9/11 or World War II, it is then that people often say, we want security, and that security demands some restrictions on our liberties, and we're willing to make that trade-off. And so even if the U.S. Supreme Court has made a ruling, there's still politics surrounding it because using popular sovereignty, we the people can try to influence the other branches of government. So civil rights, on the other hand, usually require all three branches of the government to be involved for the change to take place. And so in that sense, the level of government intervention and intrusion into our lives is greater to achieve equality. Some of that is because the inequalities that we're trying to address are so significant, are so historically important to our system. For example, slavery and the implications of slavery, the ways in which these social hierarchies and other social institutions in our society can perpetuate some of these important inequalities, makes it that the government, if it's going to deal with those inequalities, is going to have to use considerable amount of authority in order to do it. And so when you have the to deal with inequality, you need to have the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches. And further, if you need the state governments to be on the same page as what the national government is trying to do in this area, then you can see why that is a very different set of politics that are involved than we see with civil liberties. With civil rights, you demand quite a bit of action and coordination among a system that was created to be separation of powers. You created a system that had three separate branches. You created a system that had a national government and state governments. And to ask that system of government to act quickly is very difficult for it to do. And so civil rights generally takes a long period of time to achieve the goals that are stated by the individual, equality achieved in particular areas. The other thing is that you can see that if you have a large role of government in society in order to deal with the inequalities that exist, you can have that there are many people ideologically and some very selfishly do not support such government action. They argue that there may be those inequalities might be bad, but maybe, for example, we need other institutions to deal with those concerns. So, for example, we could allow our churches to deal with those things, to allow the capitalist system to deal with the economic inequalities that exist, to allow a rising tide to lift all ships, or other ways in which people argue that other institutions in society are better positioned to deal with these inequalities. The other is that the scope and role of government inequalities are ones that some ideologically, particularly libertarians, will be against. That they argue that the power that you give the government to be able to deal with these inequalities or pervasive inequalities that exist in our system allow those government authorities to abuse that power. And it's the same concern that we saw with the framers, that if you increase the power of the national government, then there is also the potential for them to use those tools to do bad as well as to do what is good and what is right. And so the politics of civil rights generally takes a longer period of time. It's much more intense. There are people who are already stepping out of support particular approaches to solving these problems because ideologically they disagree with it. And there's going to be much more of this when we talk about civil rights in Chapter 16. And the other is pointing out that there are key distinctions, as we talked about the idea from civil rights being associated with political rights and civil liberties being associated with political freedoms. You can see that there can be some important trade-offs. And so what we're going to be talking about in a little bit is the ways in which protecting civil liberties, protecting something like freedom of speech, may have implications for certain groups more than for other groups. And so as we're going to be talking about with online harassment, there are certain groups in society who face that online harassment much more directly, much in a scarier way than other people in society. And so this important civil liberty of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, is really important. But some people experience that a lot more than others. The downsides to it, the costs of it, the idea is that if, in order to have freedom of speech, you need to be able to say whatever you want, but that might also include some harsh words and some scary things that come into the realm of looking like threats or something like that, then that might actually be asking certain groups in society, particularly women, Jewish Americans if it's anti-Semitism, other minority groups, to bear the costs of that more than other people in society. And so that has an implication that we have some inequality in terms of the impact of protecting freedom of speech.